Good afternoon, everyone. Time for another silver update. Now, this is the trend line that I have been watching very carefully because you can see the significance of this trend line. It goes all the way back to December of 2012, late November, and it has a significant number of touch points. You can see it's a very significant downtrend line. I've drawn two in here. The first one is the one that I've been drawing for the longest time. It cuts through this one spike, it meets all these touch points, and it meets these touch points here. So I consider the lower one to be the more valid one, but I went ahead and drew one through these the tops of these other spikes. You can see we're just challenging that upper one now. We have substantially broken through the lower one. So it appears that we're reaching that point that I've been talking about for quite some time, where silver just can't keep going down forever. We know it can't go to the price of zero. Of course, it's a paper market, so in theory, they could put the price at zero, but by doing so, they would essentially shut down their paper market. So we know they can't do that. Now, the volume coming in is significant, certainly over the last year, but it is not nearly as large as the selling volume we had on the massive April 15th tax day Boston Massacre smackdown, and then the subsequent selling volume that came in that established this mini downtrend line here, which was broken. Now, eventually the price of silver has to turn around. I think it is turning around now. It is already, in my opinion, below the cost of mining. It's for a long time been below the cost of recycling. So for the most part, the only silver that gets recycled is silver that's in jewelry or coins and things that people have, or antiques and things like that. It's certainly not worthwhile for anyone to go out and reclaim the silver that is discarded in electronics. So this point here may be the bottom point for this trend, and if it is the bottoming point, we may see this type of volume come in on the long side, and this trend line here in volume continue as we get some massive volume in once the paper longs are convinced that it's safe to go long without surprise smackdowns coming from the powers that be. So this is a very encouraging sign. We'll have to follow this. Certainly the price of 21 is going to be a confirmation that this year-plus long trend line has finally been broken. Now we're going to continue with the Silver in Scripture series. If you remember, we started off with, in part 1, we started off with the law of first occurrence, and that was with Abram and the field that he ended up purchasing to bury his wife. Now we're going to continue in Genesis, and we're going to jump around a bit. The main point is going to be trying to determine the value of silver based upon various goods and services that are traded, and that's cited in certain verses. The first one that we come upon after the story of Abraham is this story about Joseph. Now, Joseph was his father's favorite. He was considered by his brothers to be a tattletale because he always told his father Jacob about the evil deeds that his brothers were doing, and he was his father's favorite. He had his coat of many colors, and his brothers hated him. They conspired. They wanted to murder him, but his older brother prevented that, and he ended up being cast into a pit. Then they ended up selling him as a slave, and you know the story. He went down into Egypt, and ultimately, as a type of Christ, he ended up saving his entire family when the famine hit. But you can see the price here of 20 pieces of silver. Now, what's the significance of that price? Well, first of all, we know that Christ was betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, but this apparently is the price of a slave. So, be that as it may, a slave at that day apparently was valued at 20 pieces of silver. Now, the term that we're going to use the most is shekel. I'm assuming that this is a shekel, but I don't know for sure that this is a shekel. The weight, the common weight that I've used for the shekel, I'm comparing it to the U.S. silver dime, assuming that was 90%. Probably it was close to that. So I'm substituting a U.S. silver dime for a shekel in these studies. There's a lot of opinions out there. That's the most consistent one that I've been able to find. So you can see here the story goes on. We know the story of Joseph and the price that he gave for the reward to his brother Benjamin ended up being 300 pieces of silver. You can see in Genesis 45:22, this is when his brothers are coming to him when he is an overseer in Egypt. They're coming to buy grain, and he gave each man changes of raiment, but to Benjamin, that's his younger brother, he gave 300 pieces of silver. And that's interesting that he gave that to Benjamin and not to them. So the rest of this, there's a number of references to the way the Jews spoiled the Egyptians when they asked of them jewels of silver, jewels of gold. In a lot of these references, we're going to find that silver is mentioned first. It's mentioned before gold. We'll continue down. We go into the law, and the law has a lot of silver referred to, not only in offerings, but in the building of the temple. I'm not going to reference a lot of those because there's not really an economic price to reference that. We are going to see the amount that went in when we look at the last verse about the amount of silver that David collected when he was king. So we'll go down and skip most of what's in Exodus, and then we're going to move on to the first verse that's in Judges. And this is a verse where Micah, who is looking for a priest to dwell with him, Micah said unto him, Dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest, and I will give thee 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel, and thy victuals. So this was a wage that was offered to this person to be a priest for them, for his family, and it was a yearly wage. It was 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of apparel, and all of his food. So he had food and lodging, we'll say, but he also had his wage, which was 10 shekels of silver. So that seems to give a very high value to silver, something less than a shekel a month for the wage. We don't know how much of the value was in the suit or how much was in him being fed all of his meals, but we do know that he was offered that 10 shekels for a year's worth of service. The next verse we're going to look at is from 1 Samuel, and this is a story where we're introduced to Saul. He ultimately becomes king over Israel, and he is searching for the lost flocks, and he ends up going to consult Samuel, the man of God, or seer, to help him with his search for this lost flock. And they are concerned because they don't have anything to offer the man of God to give them advice. And he says, And the servant answered Saul again and said, Behold, I have here at hand the 4th part of a shekel of silver, that will I give to the man of God to tell us our way. And so that was the amount that they agreed upon. Apparently that was in their mind, valuable enough to go to the man of God and offer that to him. So what does that mean? How is that valued? I can't say. It's just something that gives a little bit more information about what silver is valued as. The next one is from 2 Samuel, and this is the case where David, because of the sin he committed by taking Bathsheba and having her husband put to death, he was cursed, and ultimately in his family, his own son rose up and overthrew him, and he had to flee, and a large number of people went with him, including his general, we'll say Joab, and Joab was seeking Absalom's life, even though David had warned everyone to return him alive, but Joab wanted him dead. And this is the story of a young man who found him. He was hanging in a tree. There was a battle in the forest, and he went into the forest on his horse and ended up hanging from a tree branch. And Joab said unto the man that told him, Behold, thou sawest him, why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? And I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle. So there's the value of the life of this enemy of the king. It was valued at 10 shekels and a girdle. Now the man ended up replying to Joab saying, even if you would have offered me 1,000 shekels, I would not have disobeyed the king's order. So 10 shekels apparently would have been a decent reward. 1,000 shekels we would assume would be a king's ransom. 1,000 shekels, based again on my assumption that it's roughly that silver dime, then we're talking about roughly $2,000 to $3,000 reward, and that would have been considered a king's ransom type of reward, and that just gives you more idea about the value. The next verse we're going to look at is from 1 Chronicles 22. And this is the amount of silver and gold that David had prepared for the house of the Lord. If you remember, David had it in his mind to build a temple, but the temple, he was not allowed to build that temple because he was a bloody man, a man of war. So his son Solomon was going to build this temple, and David spent the rest of his time as king accumulating all of the items necessary to build the temple. And all those verses that we skipped over, there were many verses about sockets and fillets and a lot of these things that were used in the construction of the temple. So David, and by the way, David was the one who gave the instructions to Solomon of exactly how the temple was to be built. So he knew exactly what was required, and this is the amount that David accumulated in that time period where he was just gathering all of the materials that Solomon would need to build the temple. Now behold, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron without weight, for it is in abundance. Timber also and stone have I prepared, and thou mayest add thereto. So that was the amount that David had gathered. Now there's a lot of speculation about where he gathered it. At the time of David's reign, he pretty much subdued all of the enemies that were around him. He subdued the Edomites and the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Syrians and the Philistines. So all of the nations that were around David, he subdued, and many of them ended up paying him tribute. So there was gold and silver flowing into Israel at that time. during the time of David and also during the time of Solomon, there was tremendous wealth. We're going to look at that in part 3. We're going to get to the wealth of Solomon. But so a lot of the wealth of the world flowed into Israel at that time. We can't know for sure where all of that came from. The Bible refers to Ophir, which is a place where much of the gold came from. That's also where the verses talking about the value of the golden wedge of Ophir, which apparently was a very large wedge of gold. There's also some speculation as to the involvement of Phoenicians and even some controversial archaeological findings that have been found now in America of mining that occurred during that time frame. And some have speculated that the Phoenicians actually were gathering gold and silver from all around the world, and that ended up in Israel. So we don't know how much of the world's wealth was in Israel at this time, but we know that it was 1,000 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver. So 1,000,000 talents of silver. Now, the most important thing we want to see here in this verse is this ratio. Again, we find this 10-to-1 ratio. That seems to be the perfect ratio. That's the ratio for many, many years that gold and silver came out of the ground in many, many different empires, kingdoms, and nations. People have roughly valued gold and silver at a 10-to-1 ratio because that's generally the amount that comes out of the ground. 10 ounces of silver for every ounce of gold. So we see that confirmed here with 100,000 talents of gold and 1,000,000 talents of silver. Now the talent is said to be roughly 3,000 shekels. So we're talking about 3 billion shekels of silver. That's the number, and we can go by today's value. If my guesstimate about the weight of a shekel is correct, that it's roughly the value of a silver dime, then we're talking 3 billion shekels. If we say it's $2 to $3 a shekel, then we're talking about $6 to $9 billion worth of silver that was set aside for the temple. And we'll just say that the gold is roughly the same. Now, we know that silver is very undervalued at this time. It could be undervalued by a factor of 10. So we could be talking the value of just these two precious metals in the temple could have been upwards of $100 billion in today's value. There's no way for us to know, but it is important that a large amount of the gold and silver that was around on the earth at that time ended up in Israel during the days of the reign, the ending of the reign of David and the reign of his son Solomon, who ended up building the temple. So that's very fascinating that we have that 10-to-1 ratio and that 100+ billion value or so based on the undervalued nature of silver. So we're going to go ahead and leave it off there. There's a lot of other verses we need to cover, but these verses have given us an idea of what the value is, whether it's a service, the price of a slave, or the price of land and things like that. It appears from these general notions of what silver was valued at, just as we saw in part 1, that if we look at the price of these sorts of things today and how much silver it would take to buy them, that silver is tremendously undervalued. My guesstimate would be that silver is undervalued, according to the verses we've examined so far, roughly 10 to 50 to 1. Silver should be, I would say, roughly $200 to $1,000 an ounce for you to be able to realize the type of value that is recorded here in these verses. So back to the chart, we're clearly making a bottom, at least temporarily we seem to be making that bottom. This very important trend line is starting to be broken. We can't really confirm that it is broken until we get that 21 price, and then that will be a confirmation that indeed this downtrend has been broken. And I do expect a tremendous amount of paper longs to come in and increase the buying volume, which may make for an explosive rally back to a test probably of this 26 price, which has been a ceiling for quite some time. And we'll talk to you next time.